Hello and welcome. Today we are joined by Jess Boss. Jess was the first talent hire at Neko Health, the Swedish health tech company founded by Halmar Nilsson and Spotify founder Daniel Ek. Neko Health has raised over $300 million from funds like Lakestar, Atomico, General Catalyst and Lightspeed. At Neko, Jess looks after all things talent, hiring into their core R&D, engineering and corporate functions, whilst also overseeing the medical staff hiring. Prior to Neko, Jess worked at Octopus Energy and Arrival. Great to have you with us today, Jess.
Thanks, Paddy. It's a pleasure to be here.
Awesome. So to jump right in, I'd love you to think back over your recruitment career and tell me about the favorite hire you've ever made.
It's a tough one because I think the favorite hire that a recruiter has, it can come from so many different placements. It could be like the first hire you've ever made. It could be that hire that you perhaps were sitting on the fence about, but then was an amazing hire that blew everyone away. But I think actually, if I had to choose my best one, it would be someone that I hired fairly recently. It was when I was working at Octopus Energy, and specifically the area that I recruited for, it was their technology arm called Kraken Technologies. And Kraken, since its inception, it was predominantly run by the CTO from both like a tech and product perspective. They were one of those businesses that had basically had the CTO do everything and then hired these hybrid software engineers that basically did everything from engineering to product. And what we basically decided is that we wanted the business to become more product led, which essentially meant hiring our first layer of heads of product. And the reason why I say heads is because Kraken is split into 4 separate verticals, and we wanted a head of product for each vertical. And that was essentially my job, to go out and source what were basically going to be the first pivotal heads of product for this very engineering-led company. And Kraken's ethos when it came to recruitment is that it was a combination of both like putting open a job ad and also finding time to do headhunting and seeing like what profiles came out best. And the hire that we made for one of the head of product roles was one of those people that applied almost like straight away. It was a guy, his name is Guy as well, and he was, I think, like definitely one of the first 10 applications into the role. For this specific vertical, we were looking for a product professional that had worked within a hardware industry before. And Guy had previously worked at McDonald's before then venturing into Ocado Technologies and was the head of product for their robotics division, which I think up until the last few years was probably like one of the most advanced robotics areas for the UK. So, I mean, everyone was kind of looking at this profile and we were like, oh my God, this guy looks fantastic. And I booked in a call with him, and really the conversation also blew me away. And that was because I had been in Kraken for about a few months by this point. And I think once you've embedded yourself as a recruiter in a company for a few months, you start to understand how the company works, the types of people that fit in really well into that company, the types of conversations that they have. And I felt that Guy was a little bit more of like a wild card. I felt that like he just had this kind of zest. And I feel like when you're going to be changing the way that a company thinks about how they build products, ultimately becoming a little bit more product led, you kind of need someone that's going to be able to come in, be super confident, potentially ruffle a few feathers. And that was going to be Guy, because I could tell how passionate he was about working in product led organizations or creating product led organizations. I kind of secretly knew that this is probably one of the best people that we could hire into this business to have that change. And so we put him into the interview process. He kind of had that effect on everyone else. And I think people were like, I like him, but is he Kraken, or, is he that kind of puzzle piece that would generally fit into that business? And I think it kind of boils down to like, what is your job as a recruiter? You have to really think about what is the business objective and who is going to be the best fit for the business, even when the business doesn't know what that profile might potentially be. And I was really proud of that hire because he did get the role, he accepted the job. And I think in terms of being able to deliver what he needed to deliver, which was come into an engineering-led organization convince them or continue to convince them that becoming more product led is the right way to do it, and to be able to do it in a way that was going to be collaborative to get everyone on board and initiate that change and do it well. He smashed it. And as far as I know, he's still doing an amazing job. But would it have been the profile that potentially other people might have hired in that company? Probably not. But I'm glad we did make that hire, if that makes sense. It's quite a pivotal one. But he's up there still with my number one hire so far.
Awesome. Love that. And I guess like what was it on the CV or in that first call that really hooked you?
The CV, it had to be the alignment with what we needed. Like if you looked at the hardware involvement he had in McDonald's and then moving into the robotics division at Ocado Technology, it was, from what I understood, the robotics in the Ocado warehouse was some of the most advanced robotics that we had really kind of going on. And I was like, okay, there are definitely going to be other profiles out there that are relevant, but I loved the progressive nature of the experience that he had. I thought we really were bringing what was some of the most industry leading knowledge into this company being Kraken. So I love that from a CV perspective. But during the interview, it was definitely the passion and beliefs he had about product led organizations, the confidence that he had in delivering that during the interview, where I left that call feeling extremely confident that he would be someone that would be amazing at kicking off this product led initiative for Kraken. And there aren't that many people that I think can, like I said, essentially take on the role that's going to ruffle feathers but do it well. And
Yeah, absolutely.
I had that. He had that kind of special sauce that
Love
made it
that.
work.
That's awesome. And moving on to the second question here. In your experience, what's been the difference between a good hire and a great hire? What sets them apart?
I think this is one that many people, or maybe actually just at least myself, would find it difficult to describe that difference. But I think if I had to describe it in one or two sentences, I would say the difference between a good hire and a great hire is the difference between a hire that can do the job and a hire that goes beyond the job description. But the additional detail that I would want to put into that is because a lot of people would say, well, obviously. But for me personally, what a great hire is those qualities or skill sets or traits that makes that individual go beyond the job description are skill sets, traits, and qualities that the business didn't actually realize they wanted or needed, or perhaps could actually secure within that hire. So maybe more of a surprise element that then excites everyone across the board. And we had one of these situations fairly recently where we were hiring for a senior data scientist, and we wanted this data scientist to have worked within what we call like a safety critical field of computer vision. So maybe like autonomous driving, autonomous robotics, something to that effect. And what we're trying to build is we're trying to build a 3D model of the human body off the back of the collection of thousands of different images that are taken over a very short period of time. But if we kind of went out to market trying to find someone that had built that, I mean, that is very, very niche. It would take quite a lot of time. And of course, you're a recruiter, you also understand they've got to be actively looking, we've got to be more interesting, so on and so forth. But what I did come across is this engineering organization who had built a very similar, well, they had built a very different product, but ultimately building the same type of technology to get the same kind of visualization of data that we were aiming to build. And they had also productionized it and built several generations or iterations on that product. So basically, we could have found someone that was a data scientist that had built some cool stuff within the field of computer vision. But actually, what ended up happening is we came across this engineering organization who had built something so close to what we were building that we didn't actually think would be possible to actually secure for a number of these different roles. And I think that's what moved the needle on what was a good hire, someone that had done good work within the field of computer vision that would be able to contribute value in the team, to actually someone that had built something very similar, productionized it, gone through and broken down the different challenges that they had faced so that they could actually bring much richer learning to the project that we're working on. So that's probably how I would describe it. But
That's
the
interesting.
surprise element is what makes it a great hire for me.
So what you're saying is that it goes beyond just what's on the paper or just what's on the job description. It's the other things that are brought. Is that always skills, or is that sometimes other things? You kind of talk about traits and other things there. I guess like when you think back to all the high performers that you've hired, what's been the standout quality that they've had as individuals, if there's one or if there's like a regular theme?
I would say the one that I have seen most often is actually the way that the individual thinks and communicates, and how well that communication resonates with other people across the business. And it's no surprise, really, because when you see great leaders, often they have training within that space. So sometimes you see great leaders that have done acting on the side, or they've done some kind of public speaking courses, because there's actually a lot of value that comes with being able to communicate, whether it's a complex project idea to someone or whether it's a completely new belief system across a business. But another hire that we made recently, from the get-go, the way that the individual listened and heard about our business mission, to the way that they had questions about how we were completing this mission, has resonated throughout the whole interview process into their role, so much so that they've kind of been put on this pedestal now to the point where we now need to hire, like, let's say, for example, like 20 software engineers. If we have senior leaders across the business being like, yeah, we want 20 more of those. And I think, that can really help shape a mindset, a way of thinking across the business. So it doesn't necessarily need to be the practical experience that they've got within certain projects. That is super valuable, but also these softer skills are super valuable as
Yeah.
well.
I sometimes talk about it as the rate limiter of talent is communication, because it
Yes.
doesn't really matter how talented you are or how capable you are if you
Mm.
cannot translate that into collaboration, into working with others, you will never really fulfill it. And so when I'm mentoring and coaching, particularly junior engineers or technical people, it's kind of explaining to them that that is a hard skill. We kind of
Mhm.
split these into hard and soft skills, but ultimately, if you're the most talented person in the world, but no one wants to work with you, there's only ever so much you're going to be able to achieve. And I think when you
Yeah.
frame it like that, it can help people punch through and realize that actually this is something you have to train. Some people are born being great communicators, but the vast majority of us need to work on it.
Yeah. And then I think as well, if you look at it from the angle of just knowledge sharing in general, I mean, if it's someone that can't communicate very well and then is keeping all of that knowledge inside their brain, and the only other way that people can learn it is through looking at their code, for example, if we look at it from like a software engineer example, that rate of learning for everyone else is massively diminished because you have to wait for them to read all of the code and understand it. If that person can communicate it or actually put together a completely new way of thinking as an engineering team and then get everyone to think in that same way because of the way that they've been able to communicate it and teach it to others. I mean, then you've got a team of 10, 20, 30 engineers that all think like that individual.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that as we see, particularly as like AI tools take over in some areas, the value will accrue to those individuals that can define and communicate a problem the most crisply. And so, your ability as particularly for engineers today or product managers or whatever role really, it's how well can you define the problem? How
Mhm.
well can you communicate what needs to happen? Because that will be actually the most important part of the puzzle. Moving on to some of the roles that you've worked, what's been the most challenging role that you've worked? Maybe one at Neko. What's been the most challenging role you've worked recently?
It's actually funny that you bring up Neko because it's actually been Neko that's been like some of the toughest roles I've actually recruited for. And I think it's such a humbling experience that we should all continue to have. Um, because just when you're continuing to build your recruitment career, often it is the case where, some roles definitely become a lot easier to recruit for than others. I've actually been really happy that Neko has been a business that has stretched me beyond what I knew already, because you always want to continue, working on more challenging roles so that you can continue to develop and get better. But yes, it has been at Neko. The most challenging team has been the regulatory team. And the reason behind this is because people who go into the field of regulatory are like people who go into the field of law. And actually, you often find people that have studied law that go into regulatory because the type of mindsets that do well in the field of regulatory also come from that background, which is essentially going through all of the different types of documentation that we need to comply with, and make sure that the business that they're working for, no matter what they're building, is remaining compliant. And it's basically seen as the same as staying within or operating within the law, basically. But when you're working in a fast-paced, innovation-heavy tech company, regulatory fields or professionals that are too bogged down into the detail can actually hinder innovation. And sometimes you try to put regulatory with fast-paced, very futuristic style startup, and they just clash. Like, I've actually had people that I've reached out to for the regulatory team being like, thanks, it sounds super cool, but I don't want to work for a company that looks like science fiction. Because for them, they just look at our business and go, this looks like a regulatory nightmare, because we are really trying to bend the realms of what was previously possible, which means for a regulatory professional is probably a lot of work. So how we basically went about this is that we had to do a complete market mapping of not only like medical device or tech companies that had this electrical, hardware, software, AI meshing that Neko has, but also companies that are working at pace so that we can find those individuals that understand, okay, this is exactly what we need to do to remain compliant. And this is how we behave as a regulatory team to support the speed of the business and to make sure that we are actually contributing to innovation as opposed to slowing it down. And it's taken like a few months to build out that team and that capability, but now we understand fully the types of traits that work well in that team and the company sizes, the rate of growth that those companies probably need to have gone through in order for that experience to really map. And then you kind of find that pool, but it's a niche pool of individuals. So
Yeah, it's interesting. I had a similar thing when I was hiring for some legal roles, and it's almost like a mindset. It's like, a very, most lawyers will tell you why something can't be done, or why you shouldn't, or they'll be very clear about exposing the risks, and that's what they're trained to do, right? Identify
exactly.
and mitigate risk. I think the very best in that profession will say, here is the law, here are the risks, here is what you need to know, and here is the most sensible way to navigate those challenges to achieve your goal. And it's that second piece that you need, and that's a combination of a bit of creativity, it's a combination of a bit of guile to some degree, and you have to combine that with really great integrity to make sure they're not just sort of bending the rules too much, but it's like, how do we interpret and understand and balance all of these things to produce the most optimal outcome for everybody involved? And it is a hard thing to test for, but sounds like you're well on the way to cracking that one there.
Yeah.
In the past, when hires haven't worked out, what have been some of the learnings? What have been some of the patterns that you've seen from those experiences?
Yeah, I would say very fortunately, I haven't had any hires that haven't worked out recently, which has been great. But maybe I can actually give credit to the experiences that I had a little earlier on in my recruitment career, where I definitely did have those situations. And actually, it has helped mold the way that I assess candidates. What I would say is, or maybe if I'll start with an example because I just think it helps lay the groundwork of really the answer. And this is where I was in a recruitment agency, and it was just a classic recruitment agency situation where I was really meant to specialize within software engineering. Jobs were a little bit few and far between. A head of product role comes up from some business development that I did, and I was just like, well, I mean, it's got a huge salary on it. Why would I not work it? So suddenly I became a product specialist as well. and start hiring for a head of product role for a fintech company. And they were a startup, 20 people. So it's actually really interesting how they were bringing like a head of product into the business so early. Um, and we basically went through the interview process. We got it down to 2 candidates in the final stage, but 2 very different profiles. So we have candidate A, who is from a much more corporate kind of background, much larger organizations, but had kind of worked within this AI spin out field within these types of organizations, very much branded as a startup within a larger organization, which we've kind of all heard of before. And what was attractive about candidate A is that they had actually risen into like a CPO role previously. And what the company liked about that is that they were like, okay, well, for the first 6 to 12 months, like maybe they might be a bit overqualified, but years 1 to 5, this person is going to be perfect and will be able to bring so much knowledge to help us, make sure that we don't basically run into a load of mistakes that they've already faced. So that's product A. Product B was someone that had come from these startup, very scrappy environments, very well versed into how those companies operate, and was a lead product manager, very experienced, but was looking for a step up into the head of product role. Still equally very well qualified, but really what like the opportunity was there to hire that person was that they'd be perfect for the first 6 to 12 months, but then the future growth of the business would either rely on that person being able to upskill and upskill quickly, or potentially they would need to look at hiring a CPO at some point in the future who would then manage that head of product. And what started to happen is the kind of amber flags that you might have thought about with someone coming from a very different company background, moving into a startup, started to manifest during the offer process. So the client decides to offer candidate A after kind of deliberating the pros and cons across each profile, but they didn't reject profile B just in case. Profile A started to really get bogged down into the detail of the offer. So, for example, wanting to change the title to a CPO role right at the end of the interview process, wanted to have a very detailed like job description of the role, which, these are things that like everyone can understand. There's actually value in having a job description so that that person knows their deliverables. But we've also worked with these startups where they don't have a job description. And it is a little bit more definitely representative of what was going on internally, essentially. And all I could basically keep thinking is that I think Profile B would be much better suited if this is going to be the kind of working arrangement, because clearly candidate A is already struggling with the level of chaos, disorganization that this company has. And my regret there is not speaking up enough to the client and advising them enough, because I felt that I was too early on in my career. They've probably hired loads of these people before, maybe I just didn't think that I was right. And so candidate A did end up accepting that job offer, signing the contract. And then again, like even with the contract, there was a lot of like back and forth with wanting to amend things. And what happened was that within 12 weeks, I mean, that person was very clearly not a good fit into the company. And then they both mutually decided to like exit the agreement. And so what I've basically carried with me is that when you start to see those amber flags, your job as the recruiter is to make that known to the hiring managers, to anyone in the hiring team. And especially if those amber flags start to manifest into something that's a little bit more of a red flag, it is still your responsibility to pitch that idea, because some people might not. And sometimes hiring managers can be conflicted with like really fast recruitment times. They don't have the person in their team. They just desperately want them in there. But as a recruiter that hiring the wrong person is just going to cause so much more of a headache further down the line. So really, I would say the traits that I've found with people that either have worked or haven't worked in roles, it usually does come down to like, what do they look for out of a business and out of a role? And can we give that to them? And there's no point sometimes trying to sugarcoat it. You've just got to be super honest about who you are as a business and whether you think that that person would be would enjoy the role there, and making sure that any hesitations that you have are more well known. And remember that you're the specialist.
Nice.
So yeah, if
Yeah, I
that
love
answers the
that.
question.
Yeah, absolutely. Got a couple of sort of quick fire questions now, just to kind of get a few more bits of wisdom from you, Jess. What advice would you give a person that is applying to Neko or to any role, really?
Yeah. Well, Neko is like a very fast growing tech company. So really this advice would span across any fast growing tech company, or really, to be honest, it could be any company. But the advice that I would give to someone if you're going to be applying for a role is to make yourself known. And I feel like that is a very vague answer to kind of like go into a bit more detail, because everyone will be like, well, what does that mean? And it kind of goes back to like when we were younger. I'm sure all of our parents have said, well, back in my day, I would have just gone to the office and said that I want to speak to the boss. But basically, the premise is true. It's making yourself stand out to everyone else that's applying into that role. At Neko, people might have already seen already, we don't actually have a lot of jobs on our careers page. We predominantly headhunt for a lot of our roles, but we do occasionally also post roles on our careers page. But whether there's a role on the company's careers page or not, I personally have got pretty much every single one of my jobs through connecting with key people in that organization that I want to work for and directly communicating with those individuals to communicate my passion and drive to want to work in that company. So that's what I would do. If you see a live role, apply to it. If you don't, go straight onto LinkedIn. But either way, you should go straight to LinkedIn, and connect with the relevant people in the organization. Make yourself known, share your CV with them, or even like guess their email structures. It's kind of easy to do. Most companies are like first name dot last name. Don't worry about it looking a little bit intrusive. Just say, I hope you don't find this too intrusive, but I'm super passionate in joining your organization. You will get noticed more. And then I would say, once you pass that bar, then as soon as you're in the actual interview, try to make yourself stand out a little bit more as well. At Neko, a common question that we ask most people is for you to tell us about something that you've seen or read recently or spoken about that has completely blown your mind. And that is because we're trying to build a product that's going to completely blow people's mind. And therefore, we want those kind of thinkers or those people that are trying to stay on top of what is going on in the world right now that is, a huge advancement within a particular field, or maybe it's a really quirky design that they've seen that they thought was super innovative. We want those thinkers, those creative minds. So I would be prepared with some additional information to make you stand out a bit more.
Awesome. Last two questions from me. What
Okay.
do you wish hiring managers knew about recruitment?
I think that what a talent team needs to operate at their best is to have as much notice of hiring needs as possible. The more time that the talent team has to understand the vacancy, what it is that we're looking for, going out to market, finding like a really strong group of individuals that could potentially fulfill that role, and bring them through the interview process so that that hiring manager on time has the capability to choose the best candidate for the role, ideally out of a few different individuals, is amazing. And it's therefore that notice, that latency that comes with a really healthy recruitment process that I think we need to bring more to hiring managers' attention. And then I think as well, on top of that, I wish hiring managers knew how valuable it is when they really partner so well with the talent team. And I really try to almost exaggerate like the compliments to the stakeholders internally who do an amazing job of dedicating time and effort to work with the talent team. That's why they're called talent partners, because they partner with someone who is that hiring manager in order to find that top 1 to 5% of talent for their team. So really seeing that that investment really does equal more output when it
Love
is
that.
committed.
Love that. And very last one, what do you wish candidates knew about recruitment? What do you think they would benefit from knowing about how recruitment actually works?
I would love for candidates to have a slight mindset shift It's not everyone that I speak to, but a slight mindset shift to know that we're actually on your team. We are super excited to bring amazing people into the business, and we want those people to feel like the role and the opportunity with us is really exciting. And in order to help get that perfect match, the more transparency and trust that you can give the recruiter that you're working with, the more likely we're going to be able to help you find the job of your dreams with the package of your dreams as well. So for there to not be too much, or to move away from I need to keep my cards close, to how can we work together as best as possible as a team so that I can get the job of my dreams and you can hopefully have an amazing person join the team to contribute to the business. I would love for it to feel a bit more like that for everyone
A
that we
bit more
speak
like
to.
a collaboration than a kind of back and forth. Yeah, 100%. Jess, fantastic. Thank you ever so much. This has been
Thank you.
brilliant. Thank you for your time. We will definitely have you back on at some point in the near future. But all the best with everything over at Neko. And if you, when you want to come back on, let us know.
Amazing. Thanks, Paddy. It was great.
Awesome. Thanks.